The train came into Harrow Flats at 3:30 on a Wednesday, and Ada Whitmore stepped off it with a trunk, a leather satchel, and no particular illusions about what she was doing there. The notice had been plain: rancher seeking wife, dairy experience required, 30 head of milk cows, house on the property. She had answered it plain in return: widow, 34, 8 years in a Vermont dairy operation, 6 of those running it, available immediately. She had not included the part where the dairy no longer belonged to her. She had answered the question asked and no more. A man was supposed to meet her at the depot. She waited 40 minutes in a chair inside the stationmaster's office, her bag at her feet, her hands folded in her lap, watching the street through a window filmed with road dust. Harrow Flats was small and deliberate: a mercantile, a hardware, a church with a crooked steeple, a livery with a hand-painted sign that had weathered down to suggestion. The people moving through it moved with the unhurried purpose of people who had made their peace with where they were. She had not made her peace with Vermont. There was nothing to go back to there. At 4:20, a wagon pulled up, not hurrying, not slow, arriving the way a man arrives when work has no set stopping time and the clock is a suggestion rather than a rule. He climbed down, and he was taller than she had pictured from the notice. Long in the jaw, weathered past his age or exactly his age, difficult to judge. He wore the same coat he had been wearing in the barn all morning, from the look of it, and he did not apologize for it. He looked at the trunk at her feet, then at her, and said one word: "Whitmore." "Row," she answered. He picked up the trunk without being asked. She filed that away. If this story is already pulling you in, hit that like button and subscribe to The Hidden Acre, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. There's something about a frontier love story that finds exactly the people who need it. Let's see who's here. They drove out of town in something close to silence, which suited her. The land on either side of the road was open and grey gold under the September sky, and Ada watched it with the attention she gave to most things, steady, without declaring itself. She asked him twice about the herd on the drive, and he answered in the same plain way the notice had been written: 32 head at the start of summer, 30 now, down 2 in August, to something he hadn't been able to name, 1 more since. The cows were thin, producing less than they should, and he had tried adjusting the grain in July and seen no result. "I know horses," he said, "not cows." "Who milked them before?" "Hired man, left in June." "How often are you milking now?" "Morning, once a day." She looked at the road ahead and said nothing more about it until they reached the property. The row place was 20 minutes out of Harrow Flats, set below a ridge that caught the worst of the northern wind. The house was 2 rooms and kept cleanly: a good stove, a porch that faced east, curtains in the windows she would not have expected from a man living alone for any length of time. The barn was larger than the house. That told her something about what had been built here and why. She asked to see the cows before they went inside. Silas Rowe looked at her the way a man looks at a request he hadn't anticipated coming before supper. Then he said yes, and led her down through the late-season grass. The herd was in worse shape than she had been prepared for. Not dying, most of them, but thin in the particular way animals get thin when something has been wrong long enough that no single day announces itself as the problem. She moved through them without speaking, checking eyes, running a hand along the spine of a roan that stood too still when the rest of the herd shifted around her. She crouched beside a heifer in the back corner who had gone off her feed entirely and was carrying heat in her left quarter. She stayed beside that animal a while, pressing her hand flat against the cow's side, taking her time. When she stood up, Silas was in the barn doorway. "They're being milked once a day," she said. "That's where it starts. A dairy cow needs twice, morning and evening. One milking tells the body to produce less, and she does what you ask of her consistently, and over time the loss becomes permanent." She looked at the heifer in the corner. "This one has mastitis. I'll need boiled water. Carbolic soap if you keep it, and clean cloth I can spare from what I brought. She'll live? I don't know yet. She'll have a better chance than she has right now. There was a woman named Birdie who lived in the back room of the house, a Swede, past 70, who had cooked for the previous owner and had stayed on when he sold the place because she had nowhere else that made sense to go. She was bent at the shoulders and moved slowly, but she watched Ada from the moment they came through the door with the clear, unsentimental attention of someone who has stopped performing opinions and simply sees. She had a kettle on when Ada came in from the barn and described what she needed. Clean cloth was on the table beside it, already cut into squares. He has had no luck with those cows, Birdie said, not unkindly, just as a fact. He's had no instruction, Ada said. That's a different thing. Birdie looked at her for a moment, then she picked up the kettle. Ada worked on the heifer until the light in the barn had faded to grey. Silas stayed for most of it, holding the animal when she needed it held and staying clear when she didn't, and he had the particular quality she had found in only a few people in her life, the ability to be useful without requiring acknowledgement for it. She thanked him when she was done. He went to feed the herd. She went inside. Over supper she laid out what needed to change, the milking schedule, the feed quality, the need to assess the dairy room, which she hadn't seen yet, before she could have a real accounting of what the operation was capable of producing. Silas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said simply, "All right." She had expected argument. She had spent 6 years arguing for what she knew against men who knew less and needed convincing before they would move. All right sat strange and welcome in the space where the argument should have been. Harrow Flats had opinions about Ada Whitmore's arrival before she had been there a full week. Some of them she heard directly, and some came sideways, through the particular register of small-town sociability that means one thing on the surface and something else underneath. Clarence Webb at the Mercantile extended her credit with the manner of a man extending a loan on uncertain collateral, watching her face as he did it for signs that she understood the conditions. The minister's wife stopped her on the street to welcome her warmly and ask, with a wide smile, how she was finding the Row place, the kind of question that means, tell me everything, dressed up as neighborliness. 2 women at the dry goods counter on a Thursday went quiet when Ada came in and resumed in a tone just low enough to be deliberate. None of it was new to her. She had sat in bank meetings that fell silent when she walked in. She had stood in her father's dairy and explained a treatment protocol to a hired man 20 years her senior who had needed 3 attempts at nodding before he accepted that she was the one giving instructions. She knew how to take up space in a room that wasn't sure it wanted her there. She took the same space in Harrow Flats that she had always taken, quietly, consistently, without making an issue of it. She asked Clarence Webb, directly, whether the hotel in Millhaven had a regular butter supplier. He told her the contract came out of Laramie. He looked surprised she had asked, and then looked a little more surprised that she had already thought to ask it. "Thank you," she said, and went back to the wagon. The herd began to respond in the 3rd week. Not dramatically. Cattle don't announce recovery any more than they announce sickness. But the production numbers Ada was keeping in the dairy room began to show what she had expected. The roan who had stood too still was moving with the herd again. 2 cows who had been losing weight leveled out. The heifer was still fighting, but the fever in her quarter was receding. She came into the dairy room one morning to find that a shelf she had been working around for 10 days, rotting at the base, useful for nothing but taking up space, had been pulled down and replaced with new boards, solid, at the height she needed them. She stood at the new shelves for a moment without touching them. Then she ran her hand along the top board, which was smooth and true, and started the day's work. That evening Silas mentioned, without looking up from his plate, that the east wall had the strongest floor if she needed more shelving in the future. She told him she would keep that in mind. On the morning of the 22nd day, the heifer was standing at the feed trough with the rest of the herd, her left quarter still tender but clean, her eyes tracking clearly. Ada put a hand on the animal's neck and stood there in the early dark for a moment, and it was a quiet thing, the way relief is when you have been carrying something by yourself for long enough that you had stopped noticing the weight. She didn't know Silas was in the barn until he spoke behind her. "She make it through, looks like." He was quiet a moment, looking at the heifer. "You didn't sleep much while she was bad." "No." He looked at Ada then, and whatever sat on his face in that moment was too complicated to name, so she turned back to the morning milking and let it alone. The water bucket outside the dairy room door was full when she finished, same as it had been full every morning for 2 weeks. Set there before first light, without comment from either of them. One evening at supper, about 10 days after the heifer turned the corner, Birdie set down a cup of coffee in front of Ada and said, without particular preamble, "You are counting the weeks." Ada looked up. "Since you came," Birdie said, "I can see you counting." She sat down with her own cup. "You should stop doing that." Ada did not ask what she meant by it. She thought about it later, in the dairy room, while the separator turned and the cream ran clean. She had been counting 8 weeks, 9. She had been counting the way a person counts when they have set a limit they are not ready to admit to themselves, because admitting it would mean making a decision she wasn't sure yet how to make. She finished the evening work and went inside and sat by the stove for a while and let the counting go. Ada kept a record of production in a ledger she had bought from Webb's with her own money the 2nd week of October. The numbers she was recording by November were twice what they had been in September. She had changed the feed source in early October, worked out a different grain ratio based on what she knew of the grass quality on that land, and reorganized the milking order so the heaviest producers went first, which made a difference she had not expected to be as large as it was. The dairy room, once she had cleaned it and assessed the equipment, had turned out to contain a cream separator that needed one replaced part to function properly. She had ordered the part through Webb's and installed it herself the week it arrived. She started making butter in real quantities in mid-October. The row land was good grass country, creek-fed in the lower pasture, sweet enough that the flavor came through in the cream, and Ada had the particular knowledge of what to do with good cream that comes from years of doing nothing else. The color and consistency of what she produced were different from what passed for dairy butter in most of Harrow Flats. She knew it and did not say so. Silas came back from a trip to town one afternoon and found her in the dairy room with 2 pounds of finished butter on the board and more forming in the churn. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "The hotel in Millhaven buys local butter when the quality is there," she said, still working. "Clarence Webb told me their Laramie contract costs them more per pound than it should. If we can produce consistently and I can get in front of the right person, they'd rather supply closer." "Millhaven's 40 miles. I know how far it is." She looked up then. "I'm telling you what's possible. What you do with it is your business to decide." He looked at the butter on the board for a long moment without saying anything. Then he went out to the barn to check on the herd, and Ada went back to the churn. Walt Drummond's ranch lay 3 miles east, and he had been watching the row place with the patient attention of a man who considers waiting an investment. He had made Silas an offer on the land the previous spring, a fair price, he called it, the fairness depending on how badly a man needed to sell. Silas had declined, but the note on the row property came due in February, and Drummond had quietly obtained from the Laramie Bank a piece of paper showing first right of purchase if the note went unpaid, which Silas did not know about. He came in November. A social call, cheerful and easy, the kind of ease that costs a man nothing because he knows the hand he's holding. He sat at the table and accepted the coffee Birdie poured him and looked at Ada with the frank, dismissive attention of a man who has decided a woman's presence is a thing to note and move past. He talked about the winter coming hard. He talked about the challenges of carrying a small herd through it. He talked about his offer, which remained open as a gesture of neighborliness. And then he looked at Silas and said, smiling broadly, "Your hired help, getting the dairy sorted out, is she? I've heard the numbers have improved some." There was a moment, a long one. "She's not hired help," Silas said. It was the right answer. It came a breath too slow, in the way things come when a man is calculating what honesty will cost him in front of someone like Drummond, and Ada heard the calculation. She understood it. She did not excuse it. After Drummond left, she went to the dairy room and stayed until the light was low, going over the November numbers in the ledger with more attention than they required. Silas came to the door an hour later and stood at the threshold. "He had that loaded before I could get ahead of it," he said. "I know." She did not look up from the ledger. "Ada," she looked up. He had his hat off and was turning it in his hands in the way she had come to understand meant something was difficult to say. "What I said wasn't the right answer." "You said the right thing. You said it behind where it should have been." She turned a page. "The November numbers are better than October. You should look at them when you have time." He left. The door stayed open behind him, which she had learned was his way of leaving a thing unfinished. In the morning, the dairy room door had a new latch on it. The old one had stuck in cold weather, and she had mentioned it once in October, and not again. The new latch worked clean and smooth. She stood at it for a moment before she started the day's work. If this story has found you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from the Hidden Acre. The best ones are still coming, and the people who watch all the way to the end are exactly the ones who understand what these stories are really about. She drove to Millhaven alone in the last week of November, early enough that the sun was still a suggestion on the horizon when she left the Row place. Silas had offered to come. She had told him there was no need. This was not a rebuff. It was simply that the conversation she was going to have at the Millhaven Hotel was a conversation about price and volume and supply calendar, and she had been having that conversation since she was 24 years old, and she was better at it without someone beside her who might be assumed to be the one doing the talking. The hotel manager was a practical man who thought well of himself, which was fine. She had negotiated with worse. She told him what the Row dairy was producing and what it could produce by March, if conditions held. She told him what the Laramie contract was costing him per pound and what she would charge instead. She told him the butter would be consistent and she would stand behind the quality personally. When he asked who owned the dairy operation he would be contracting with, she gave him Silas Row's name for the property and her own for the operation, and he wrote them both down, which seemed right to her. She came back in the late afternoon with a signed agreement for £16 per week from December through March at a price the Laramie contract couldn't match. Silas read it standing up, his coat still on. He read it twice. Then he looked at her. "You told them to expect more in spring," he said. He had read that part carefully. "I told them what I believe the spring production will be. I was conservative." Birdie, who had been at the stove across the room through all of this, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one. Silas glanced at her. Birdie kept her eyes on what she was stirring. That evening, Ada told him about the cheese press. She told it plainly, with numbers, what a small, hard cheese operation would require, what it would return, how long before it turned the corner into profit. She had been thinking about it for 6 weeks. The math was solid. When she finished, Silas was quiet for long enough that she thought he was working out the cost in his head, which he could do faster than most men she had known. Then he said, "Where would you put it?" She looked at him. "The press," he said. "I'm trying to picture the dairy room." She told him where she would put it. "The east wall," she said, "closest to the floor drain." He nodded once and said the east wall had the strongest floor. They talked about spring for another half hour while the fire in the stove did its work, and Ada said things out loud about the future of the Roe dairy that she had only been saying to herself until that evening, and Silas listened and asked the kind of questions that meant he was actually thinking about what she was saying rather than waiting for her to finish. The feeling of thinking out loud with another person about a future she expected to live in, it was strange, in a way she hadn't been prepared for, and she let it be strange for a moment before she answered his questions, and then she answered them. The cheese press went in against the east wall in February. Silas did most of the moving on a Saturday, when the weather was too rough for outside work, and Ada directed from the doorway until it was where she needed it. When it was in place, they stood and looked at the dairy room together, in the way you look at something that has been properly solved. He asked her to stay the way a man asks when asking is not a thing he has practice with. It was January, the December production numbers between them on the table, the fire doing its work, Birdie long since in bed. He had said nothing formal in the 3 months since Drummond's visit, but he had been saying things another way, steadily, in the particular language of a man who shows up rather than speaks. The new latch, the shelves, the water bucket, full every morning before she came down. The Friday 2 weeks before Christmas, when he had come back from town with a bag of coffee beans she hadn't asked for, setting it on the dairy room work table without comment, because she had mentioned in passing that the grounds were getting thin, and he had heard it. "The Guernseys in Millhaven," he said. "When you go in March to look at them, are you planning to come back here after, or somewhere else?" She looked at him. He had taken his hat off. He was looking at her directly, which cost him something she could see, and she understood the cost, because she knew by now what directness was worth to a man who had spent years in his own company on a property he was trying to hold together alone. "I built those shelves because I wanted you to have what you needed to work," he said, "not because it was part of an arrangement." He set the hat on the table. "The land note. I went to the bank in Laramie last month and refinanced it. Drummond doesn't have first right anymore. I should have told you when I did it. I didn't, because I didn't know how to say what it meant without sounding like I was." He stopped. "Like you were asking me to stay," she said. "Yes." The fire settled. Outside, the January wind moved through the eaves of the barn, where 38 cows waited out the dark in the warmth she had built for them. Ada thought about the year she had run her father's dairy after his death, 6 days a week, every decision, every account, because it was hers, and she understood it, and she was good at it. And one day, her husband's family had arrived with papers proving the deed had never been transferred into her name, and she had no legal claim to a thing she had built and kept. She had left Vermont with what fit in a trunk. She had answered a notice that was honest about what it was offering, because honest was what she could work with. She thought about the heifer who had been closest to lost and was now the strongest producer in the herd, stubborn and particular and stronger for having nearly not made it. "I'll go to Millhaven in March," she said, "and come back here after." He nodded once. He picked up his hat. "The Guernseys," he said. "You should negotiate the price yourself." "I know," she said. She was already thinking about the spring numbers. By April, the Roe dairy had 38 head, a cheese press against the east wall, and a supply agreement that had grown to include 2 establishments in Millhaven and 1 farther east that Clarence Webb had connected them with, after tasting the butter himself and deciding he wanted some credit for introducing it. The land note was in good standing. The production records from that first September through the current month, filled out in Ada's handwriting in a ledger Silas had set on the dairy room workbench without explanation sometime in October, showed what could happen when 30 starving cows were treated with knowledge and care and given what they needed to do their work. The heifer who had nearly been lost was 4 years old, and her second calf was in the barn beside her, already showing the same stubborn particular quality that Ada had suspected early and trusted. Birdie made biscuits on Sundays with Roe dairy butter and told anyone who sat at that table that it was the finest in the territory, which she could not prove and did not try to. One morning in April, cold still in the way April is cold on the high plain, Ada came down to the dairy and found Silas already there, checking the press fittings the way he checked everything she had built, quietly, without announcement, making sure it held. He looked up when she came in. "Press seems good," he said. "It is." He reached for the morning bucket. She took the one beside it. They went to the herd together, and the barn was warm from the animals, and the work was what it had always been, particular and early, and requiring more than most people assume it requires, and none of that had changed. What had changed was that there was nothing in the row place that did not belong to both of them now, including the future they were building inside it, and they did the morning milking side by side in the way two people do things when they have stopped keeping a careful count of what is owed to whom. That is not a small thing on the frontier, where everything costs something, and what is freely given means something because of it. They chose it every morning. That was the whole of it. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. The people who finish the whole story are the ones who feel it, and the ones who share it. If this one stayed with you, the next video on your screen is waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come back. There's always another story about two people on the frontier who found each other when they'd stopped expecting to. And we tell those stories here, at the Hidden Acre.